Listen closely, because once you hear this, you cannot unhear it. Imagine walking into a town where the air itself feels wrong, where every house stands silent, every chair still pulled out from dinner, every bed left unmade, as if the families who lived there had vanished in the middle of their breath. In the summer of 1885, investigators rode into Quicksilver Creek, Texas, expecting the sounds of hammers, laughter, and the clamor of miners. Instead, they stepped into silence so absolute it felt like trespassing inside a tomb. Horses pawed nervously at the ground. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. And then, they opened the doors. Inside the homes, clothes were folded neatly on chairs. Lamps still held oil but were unlit. Half-written letters lay abandoned on tables, ink dried mid-sentence. Children's toys were scattered across the dirt floors, except the children themselves were nowhere to be seen. The entire town of nearly 300 souls had evaporated, leaving nothing but the oppressive weight of absence. The investigators moved toward the mine. There, in the blackness below the earth, they discovered what history was never meant to record. Piles of meticulously kept medical ledgers, thousands of pages thick, signed by 7 names: Kruger, 7 brothers, 7 scientists, 7 executioners masquerading as benefactors. And the truth inside those pages was not just a record of death, but of design. What the Krugers had orchestrated in Quicksilver Creek was not an accident, not a tragedy of mining misfortune, but a controlled experiment, one of the largest human trials of mercury exposure in modern history. They had weaponized the town itself. The mine was a crucible. The homes, laboratories. The people, unwitting test subjects. Think about that. An entire community, built not for prosperity, not for family, not for survival, but for sacrifice. Every cough, every tremor, every broken body counted, logged, measured with scientific precision. The Kruger brothers weren't merely doctors or engineers. They were architects of suffering, and the results they captured would remain 50 years ahead of mainstream medicine. Which is precisely why they were buried hidden by universities, silenced by journals, and denied by government institutions that could not afford the world to know what these men had proven. That human beings could be reduced to variables, and suffering could be mapped like an equation. The question is not why they did it. The question is, why was this knowledge erased? The story they told the world was simple. Hard-working immigrants from Prussia, brothers bound by blood and ambition, seeking fortune in the unforgiving frontier of Texas. That was the mask. And it worked, because on the surface nothing seemed out of place. Heinrich, the eldest, spoke of opportunity, of bringing European discipline to the chaos of the American West. He claimed to want order, prosperity, stability. But beneath that polished accent and iron gaze, there was something else, a design so vast and deliberate it would take decades for anyone to glimpse it. You see, each brother carried more than just a skill. Friedrich with his chemistry, Wilhelm with his engineering, Otto with his medicine, Gustav with mathematics, Bernhard with geology, and Klaus with his dangerous knowledge of European mercury mines. Together, they were not pioneers, they were a syndicate, a machine with 7 gears, perfectly synchronized. They did not stumble upon Quicksilver Creek. They selected it, isolated enough to avoid interference, fertile enough to draw workers, and rich with cinnabar or the raw source of liquid silver, mercury. To ordinary miners, mercury meant profit. To the Kruger brothers, it meant power. Think of mercury not as an element but as an ancient key. For centuries it was revered in alchemy as quicksilver, the liquid spirit of transformation. The Chinese emperors swallowed it in search of immortality. Medieval alchemists worshipped it as the blood of the earth. And in the hands of these 7 brothers, it became something far darker. A weapon to bend flesh and mind into living data points. The town was their masterpiece. Streets laid out in perfect symmetry. Wages generous enough to silence suspicion. A medical clinic presented as a gift of kindness, where every cough, every bruise, every nervous twitch was catalogued like scripture. Men believed they were being cared for. Women believed their children were protected. In reality, their lives had already been forfeited the moment they set foot in Quicksilver Creek. This was not the chaos of frontier greed. This was control. Absolute. Each shift underground was calibrated for exposure. Each family's rations were calculated to accelerate or slow the inevitable poisoning. Even the children were part of the equation. Their small bodies turned into perfect vessels to map the unseen effects of mercury on developing minds. Understand this. The Kruger brothers did not simply run a mine. They designed an ecosystem of suffering. They transformed daily life into ritual experimentation. And behind every warm smile, every reassuring word, was the cold precision of men who saw human beings as instruments, not equals. And the deeper you look, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. It began with the children. It always does. While the men labored in the shafts and the women carried the weight of daily survival, the little ones became the first mirrors of something unspeakable moving beneath the surface. Mothers noticed it in whispers. A boy who walked in perfect circles, hour after hour, unblinking, unbending, as if tethered to an invisible compass. A girl who stood for an entire afternoon with her hands twitching imprecise, repeating gestures as if spelling out a language no one alive could read. Children who answered questions, played games, laughed at jokes, only to drift back into mechanical movements, trapped between innocence and possession. Imagine being a parent in Quicksilver Creek. One day your child is chasing a ball across the dusty street. The next they are staring at a wall, whispering numbers under their breath, numbers that repeat across households, across families. 7, 14, 21. Mothers tried to pull them away. Fathers tried to shake them back into sense. But it was useless. The children's bodies obeyed something deeper, something hidden in their blood and bone. Dr. Otto Kruger arrived with his black leather bag, the eternal mask of professional concern stretched across his face. He pressed stethoscopes to tiny chests, shined mirrors into dilated pupils, scribbled notes with feverish precision. He assured the families it was nothing, a minor nervous condition, too much excitement, rich food, growing pains. But behind those reassuring words, he was recording every movement, every symptom, every deviation. The children were his most valuable data set, pure bodies, unshielded by years of slow exposure, absorbing mercury like sponges soaking in poison. And this is where the horror deepens. Because the brothers weren't merely testing the limits of poison. They were studying patterns of control, the repetition, the synchronization, the compulsions. Entire groups of children began exhibiting identical behaviors, some tapping their hands in rhythm, some walking in mirrored arcs, some standing in doorways humming at the exact same pitch. What looked like sickness was, in reality, programming. The mercury did more than destroy. It rewired. It stripped away resistance and replaced it with obedience to something unseen. The town should have rebelled. But how do you rebel against what you cannot name? Against men who feed you, house you, heal you? The Kruger brothers had constructed a prison without walls, a nightmare without screams. And the children's strange dances were not just symptoms. They were warnings, signals that humanity itself was being rewritten. And yet this was only the beginning of what investigators later found buried in those ledgers. When the investigators finally pried open the ledgers left behind in the Kruger compound, what they discovered was not the rambling madness of deranged scientists, but something far more terrifying: order, precision, beauty even in the cold architecture of suffering. Every page was filled with neat German script, numbers and diagrams, notations of symptoms, timelines of decline, cross-reference charts mapping exposure to behavior. It was not guesswork, it was an atlas of human disintegration. Picture it. One column for tremors, another for memory loss, another for the strange compulsions that overtook the children. Each case meticulously logged by name, age, occupation, and exact hours of exposure underground. Otto's medical notes read like autopsies of the living. Subject exhibits involuntary repetition of motion. Subject continues arithmetic recitation despite lack of formal education. Subject demonstrates dissociation between physical pain and emotional reaction. Hundreds of lives reduced to data points in the hands of 7 men who believed they were writing the next chapter of human knowledge. And here is the truth no one wants to admit. They succeeded. Their research predicted phenomena that mainstream medicine would not recognize for 50 years: neurotoxicity, developmental impairment, psychological conditioning through environmental exposure. They proved that chemicals could not only wound the body, but fracture the will. They unlocked the connection between biology and obedience, between poison and programming. This is why the records were silenced. Not because the science was false, but because it was too true. The government could not allow the world to know that entire populations could be manipulated through invisible substances. That minds could be bent without a whip, without a chain, just air, food, water laced with the right element at the right dose. Do you see? The Kruger brothers were not just miners or doctors. They were pioneers of control. Their mind was the prototype of a system that would echo through history: factories, schools, armies, even cities built on principles of exposure, conditioning, and compliance. And yet, not a single university dared publish their findings. Not one medical journal would print a word. The ledgers were locked away, hidden in state archives, stripped of the brothers' names. History buried the knowledge, because once a man understands that his behavior can be engineered like a machine, he never sees the world the same way again. The town had become a silent monument to this forbidden science. But the question that haunted investigators was this: if the Kruger brothers proved control was possible, what else did they test? By the spring of 1885, the experiments had reached their most disturbing phase. The brothers no longer confined their work to measuring tremors or cataloging symptoms of decay. They wanted to know how deeply the human spirit itself could be manipulated, whether faith, memory, even dreams could be rewritten by carefully measured doses of poison. And so Quicksilver Creek became something darker than a mine. It became a theater of control. At night, families spoke of vivid, repeating dreams. Entire households reported visions of tunnels that never ended, walls closing in, rivers of silver running beneath their feet. Children woke screaming of faceless men standing at their bedsides. Wives whispered of hearing voices in the stillness of dawn, whispering numbers and commands. Yet when they spoke to Otto Kruger, he told them such dreams were common symptoms of exhaustion. But his notes reveal the truth. He had predicted these visions. He knew mercury altered not just the body, but the very architecture of thought. The brothers began assigning men to different work zones, each calibrated to release slightly altered doses of vapor. They discovered that some exposures heightened aggression, while others softened resistance. Some induced apathy, others obedience. Whole groups of men began to move and speak in sync, as though they shared one mind. The brothers called these groups clusters. They treated them not as men, but as experimental units. And then came the manipulation of faith. The Krugers insisted every Sunday be observed with communal gatherings. But these were no ordinary church services. In place of a preacher, Heinrich himself would read passages from scripture interwoven with scientific statements, data disguised as gospel. Imagine standing in a hall with your neighbors, listening to sacred words warped by a voice of authority. The wages of sin is death, Heinrich would thunder, followed by precise measurements of exposure levels and mortality rates. To the untrained ear, it sounded like a sermon. To the brothers, it was indoctrination, embedding data into the hearts of a community too loyal or too poisoned to resist. Faith itself had become an experiment. Could belief be redirected? Could scripture be twisted into a tool of obedience? The answer, written in Otto's notes, was chilling: yes. And still, the town did not flee. Because where could they go? The mine fed them. The brothers clothed them. The clinic healed their wounds. Quicksilver Creek was a closed system, an ecosystem of dependency. Escape was not just difficult. It was unthinkable. But even as the brothers perfected their machinery of control, signs of collapse were spreading. The town's silence was no longer just eerie, it was absolute. Silence has a weight to it. A town filled with hundreds of people should breathe voices, footsteps, the crack of wood splitting, the laughter of children. But by the summer of 1885, Quicksilver Creek was not alive. It was suspended like a stage after the actors have left. Neighbors began to vanish. Entire families were gone overnight, their doors left open, meals half-eaten on their tables. And yet no one asked questions aloud. Because asking meant admitting you noticed. And admitting meant you were next. The brothers documented these disappearances with chilling detachment. In their ledgers, a simple line: subject removed. Data complete. Removed to where? No one knows. Some investigators later claimed the missing were buried deep in abandoned shafts. Others believed they were transferred to secret facilities, their identities erased. But one possibility lingers like a shadow. The brothers had begun to test not just how to control life, but how to erase it, not by killing, but by stripping away the very memory of a person's existence. Think about it. What is a man if not his name on the lips of others? His face in the memory of his child? His signature on a page? Erase those things and you erase him. In Quicksilver Creek, this became a silent law. A man vanished, and within days his name was never spoken again. His wife claimed she had never been married. His children stared blankly when asked. Was it fear? Or was it something else, something engineered? Otto's notes hinted that mercury could damage not only the brain but the very mechanisms of memory. Could entire families have been conditioned to forget their own blood? And here lies the greater terror. The silence of Quicksilver Creek was not just the absence of sound. It was the absence of recognition, a void where identities had been wiped clean. The Kruger brothers had found a way to fracture the collective memory of an entire community, to create a world where the missing were not mourned, because they had never existed. The investigators who arrived later described the town as a graveyard without graves. Empty houses, empty streets, but worse than emptiness, there was erasure. Quicksilver Creek had been reduced to a laboratory of vanishing, a place where the boundaries of identity itself were tested and dissolved. And still, the ledgers grew thicker, the handwriting more fevered, as if the brothers were racing toward some final revelation. Something beyond poisoning, beyond control, beyond even erasure itself. At first, the compulsions appeared scattered, like cracks in the surface of a mirror. A man standing motionless at dawn, staring toward the mine as though awaiting an unseen command. Women gathering in groups, humming the same low note under their breath, not speaking until the sound dissolved into silence. Children walking in identical patterns across the dirt, their feet tracing invisible geometries into the ground. To an outsider, these were symptoms of madness. But to the brothers, these were results. Evidence. Proof that their experiment was evolving beyond the individual into something collective. Entire households began to move in rhythm. Families who had once quarreled over supper now ate in perfect silence, chewing and swallowing in unison. On Sunday gatherings, when Heinrich read his twisted sermons, the crowd began to sway not randomly, but in waves, as if a single body with 1,000 limbs. A ritual was forming, not a faith born from belief, but one born from chemical obedience. By midsummer, the town was no longer functioning as a community. It had become an organism. The brothers called it synchronization. One man twitched, and another mirrored him. A child walked in circles, and 5 more followed. Patterns multiplied, spreading like fire through dry brush. And when the compulsion struck at night, Quicksilver Creek looked less like a town and more like a silent cult locked in secret ceremony. Investigators would later recall journals describing the events. Children arranging stones in precise triangles without instruction, women stacking wood in repeating spirals, miners carving symbols into walls they had never been taught to draw. These were not random acts. They were rituals, unconscious, unbidden, and terrifyingly consistent. The human mind, rewired by mercury, was seeking order, symmetry, meaning where none should exist. Imagine standing at your window at midnight and seeing 50 of your neighbors in the street, all walking slowly in the same direction, eyes blank, mouths shut. Imagine watching your own child rise from bed, step into that silent procession, and move with the same mechanical certainty. What do? Call out their name? Drag them inside? And if you do, what if they turn their head toward you, eyes wide but empty, and whisper numbers you've never told them? The Kruger brothers watched it all unfold from their compound above the town. And they wrote in their ledgers one word that chills the blood even now. Progress. Progress. That was the word written in the Kruger ledgers again and again, as if the suffering of hundreds could be reduced to a single metric of achievement. But progress toward what? That answer revealed itself in the final months of Quicksilver Creek, when the brothers pushed their experiment to its darkest threshold, the breaking point of will. Up to that point, the compulsions had been strange but mostly harmless rituals of movement, murmured numbers, unconscious drawings scratched into walls. But then the behaviors turned violent. A miner was found standing in the middle of the street at midnight, his hands raw and bleeding from clawing at his own chest. When asked why, he whispered only, "They told me to let it out." Days later, a mother drowned her infant in a water trough, her face expressionless, her body moving as if obeying a command from outside herself. When Otto examined her afterward, he recorded no madness. No hysteria. He wrote, "Subject compliant, will overridden." This was no longer about poison. This was about possession by design, engineered through controlled doses and exposure schedules. The brothers had discovered that mercury didn't just erode the body. It dissolved resistance. And once resistance was gone, suggestion slipped in like a knife into soft flesh. They tested it. They calibrated it. They pushed it. Men were ordered to work shifts that would kill them, and they obeyed. Women were commanded to burn their own homes, and they obeyed. Children were made to strike their parents, and they obeyed. The brothers were proving something unholy, that with enough exposure, human beings could be made to act against their own survival. Understand what that means. Free will, the very essence of man, was not immutable. Could be bent, broken, rewritten like clay in the hands of those who understood the formula. And the Kruger brothers were not fumbling in the dark. They had written it down. Tables, ratios, precise records of how much exposure it took to bend a man's will, how long it lasted, and how far he could be pushed before his body failed. When investigators pieced these notes together decades later, one truth burned through the paper. The brothers were not simply studying mercury poisoning. They were drafting the blueprint for psychological control systems, blueprints that would echo in factories, prisons, schools, and even military training for generations. And still, the question haunts the silence of Quicksilver Creek. If this was only their beginning, what was their intended end? Collapse came suddenly, like a string pulled too tight and snapping in the dark. By late summer of 1885, Quicksilver Creek was no longer a town. It was a stage, and every resident had become an actor trapped in a script they had not chosen. Investigators later described what they found with words like unearthly and indescribable, as though language itself could not capture the sight. But the ledgers told the story plainly. The synchronization had reached critical mass. At night, hundreds of townspeople began to gather without instruction, drawn into the central square like iron filings pulled to a magnet. Men, women, and children stood in perfect rows. No talking, no gestures, just silence. Then, as if commanded by some invisible conductor, they moved together. Entire groups of bodies stepping in rhythm, turning in unison, bending their arms in patterns that mirrored the strange symbols carved into the mine walls. From above, from the Kruger compound, the brothers observed and recorded every motion, noting the precision, the duration, the deviations. Their subjects were no longer individuals. They were a single organism. But the rituals did not stop at movement. One evening, nearly 200 people dropped to their knees at once, pressing their foreheads into the dirt and holding the position for hours, unmoving, while children stood over them whispering numbers in chorus. Another night, families set fires to their own homes in perfect synchronization, then stood in front of the flames, faces blank, watching their lives burn to ash. No cries, no struggle, only obedience. What force could compel a mother to burn the bed her child once slept in? What unseen hand could guide a man to slit his palm open and smear blood across his own front door, smiling as though it were holy? These were not choices. They were commands, executed flawlessly by minds that no longer belonged to themselves. And when the investigators finally stumbled upon the scene weeks later, the square was still littered with ashes and symbols carved deep into the soil, circles, triangles, spirals, repeating endlessly, as though the earth itself had been drafted into the experiment. The witnesses who survived long enough to give testimony admitted something that chills the blood even now. They felt drawn to join in. Even those who had never been exposed to the mine claimed the urge to move in rhythm with the silent crowd was nearly impossible to resist. Quicksilver Creek was no longer a community. It had become a machine, and every human heart inside it was a cog. When the investigators finally entered the Kruger compound, they expected to find men intoxicated by power, scribbling feverishly in their ledgers. Instead, they found silence. The compound was immaculate, tables cleared, beds made, equipment polished and arranged with surgical precision. The only sign of life was the overwhelming presence of those journals. Thousands of pages stacked in neat towers, a monument to obsession. The brothers themselves were nowhere to be found. At first, federal agents assumed they had fled. Perhaps, sensing discovery, they escaped under the cover of night. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Plates of food sat untouched on the dining table, still warm in the hearth as if abandoned mid-meal. In Wilhelm's workshop, blueprints lay unrolled, instruments neatly arranged, quills left with fresh ink on their tips. In Otto's clinic, the latest entries in his notes trailed off mid-sentence. It was as if the brothers had simply stood up and walked into the air, vanishing without resistance. But deeper in the compound, investigators found something far more disturbing than an empty room. A cellar, locked, reinforced with iron bands. When pried open, the stench of chemicals and decay poured out. Inside were dozens of chairs bolted to the floor, each fitted with leather restraints. Above them, pipes and tubing descended like the veins of some mechanical beast, dripping residue that tested positive for mercury. Here, the brothers had conducted their final trials not in the mine, but in controlled chambers. And on the walls, carved in steady, deliberate hands, a single word repeated over and over: Geist, spirit. Were they attempting to separate the soul from the body? Were they seeking to capture not just data, but the very essence of man? The ledgers suggest they believed mercury was more than a poison. They believed it was a medium, a conduit between flesh and something beyond. Their notes describe moments of absence, where subjects' eyes rolled back and voices spoke in tongues they did not know. Otto wrote of communication, as though the poison minds were receiving signals from a realm invisible to ordinary men. And then the trail ends. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, just absence. Some investigators whispered that the brothers had fed themselves into their own experiment, allowing the substance to claim them, dissolve their identities into the synchronization they had engineered. Others suggested a more pragmatic theory, that powerful institutions erased the brothers, protecting their knowledge for darker purposes. But the fact remains 7 men who had enslaved a town, who had written the forbidden science of control, disappeared as though swallowed by the very silence they had created. The official record of Quicksilver Creek ends in a sentence so sterile it reeks of deceit. The settlement was abandoned due to hazardous conditions within the mine. No further investigation warranted. That was the government's statement. A neat dismissal, a clean erasure. But men who had seen the compound knew better. They had touched the ledgers, felt the ink, read the precision of notes too advanced for their time. They had watched an entire town of 300 vanish into silence. And they were ordered at gunpoint to forget. Federal agents seized every page. Crates filled with journals, diagrams, and instruments were loaded onto wagons and taken east. Some were said to have disappeared en route, rerouted into private hands. Others were locked in state archives, marked as classified. Not a single word of the brothers' work would ever see print. When journalists pried, they were stonewalled. When professors inquired, they were warned. When survivors whispered, they were shunned as lunatics. And soon, even the name Kruger was scrubbed from the rolls. But truth is not so easily destroyed. Over the years, fragments leaked out. A handful of medical notes turned up in a university basement in Boston. An engineer's sketch of the synchronization chambers was found decades later in a private collection. And investigators who had retired from service old, broken men with nothing left to lose confessed on their deathbeds to what they had seen. They spoke of the children's compulsions, of the rituals, of the way the silence seemed to bend the will of anyone who stepped into the town. These men carried that knowledge like a curse, passing it in whispers to anyone who would listen. And here lies the forbidden truth. The science was too useful to bury completely, too dangerous to destroy, because in those ledgers was a blueprint for power unlike any the modern world had known. A way to dissolve free will, to bend populations without their knowledge, to turn men into instruments of obedience. Institutions could not allow such knowledge into the public. But they also could not resist keeping it for themselves. So it was hidden, not denied hidden, not forgotten absorbed, whispered in the shadows of universities, tested quietly in prisons, refined in military programs. The fingerprints of the Kruger brothers are still here, imprinted in the invisible systems that condition us even now. And this is where you, the listener, must stop and ask yourself, how much of your will is truly your own? If you think the story of the Kruger brothers died in the dust of Quicksilver Creek, you are mistaken. Their ghost walks beside you every day in the systems that govern your work, your education, your obedience. What they proved in that forgotten town did not vanish. It evolved. Look around. Why do factories condition workers to repeat the same motions until body and mind blur? Why do classrooms enforce silence, synchronization, and ritualized responses to bells? Why does the military strip recruits of identity, shave their heads, march them in unison, and rebuild them into cogs that move as one? These are not coincidences. They are echoes, refinements of the Kruger formula, stripped of mercury but alive in principle. And the unsettling truth is this. You have lived your whole life inside Quicksilver Creek without realizing it. Every synchronized chant at a sports event, every ritualized gesture in a place of worship, every mandated routine at work, each is a descendant of that experiment. The brothers discovered that the human will is not sacred. It is programmable. And once you know that, you cannot unsee it. But here, right now, I'm going to ask you to do something very specific. Not for me, for yourself. To prove you are still more than a cog. Pause. Breathe. And if you are still with me, if you are resisting the silence that the world has built around you, leave 3 words in the comments below. I remain free, because every time you speak it, you reclaim what they tried to take. You lock your identity in defiance, declaring yourself immune to the experiment that has never ended. But ask yourself, if so much of your life has already been shaped by invisible systems, how much freedom do you really have left? And what happens when the next generation of Krugers no longer needs mercury, because they have algorithms, screens, and data streams to do the bending for them? The Kruger brothers worked with mercury. Crude, poisonous, messy. But today, their methods have been perfected into something cleaner, quieter, far more efficient. The laboratories are no longer hidden in abandoned towns. They are woven into your home, your pocket, your very thoughts. The experiment never stopped, it was simply upgraded. Surveillance has replaced the clinic. Where Otto Kruger once scribbled symptoms in leather-bound ledgers, now algorithms track your every keystroke, your pauses, your purchases, your late-night searches. Every like, every hesitation, every swipe is a data point, carefully measured. The invisible mercury today is information. You are not poisoned, you are profiled. Not weakened, you are guided. Guided toward choices you believe are your own, but were mapped long before you clicked. And just like Quicksilver Creek, where entire families thought they were being cared for while they were being studied, you are told this monitoring is for your benefit, for convenience, safety, personalization. You think you are the customer, but you are the subject. The data harvested from your behavior does not belong to you, it feeds the experiment, building models of the human mind more precise than any physician in 1885 could have dreamed. Consider the ritual behaviors. Scroll, refresh, respond to notifications, check the feed, repeat. The cycle is perfect, designed to trigger dopamine like mercury vapor once triggered tremors. Look at the vacant eyes in public places, faces lit by blue light, walking in perfect circles of consumption, just like the children of Quicksilver Creek. Controlled, predictable, silent. But here is the truth that few dare speak. This is not mere entertainment, not harmless distraction. It is a test bed, a living, global experiment in psychological control. You are the subject. Billions are the sample size. And just like the miners and their families, you were never asked for consent. The Kruger brothers may be erased from the textbooks, their notes buried in archives, but their ghost has been coded into the architecture of the modern world. If Quicksilver Creek was the prototype, then this age, this very moment, is the mass trial. And the silence that once swallowed a Texas town now spreads across entire nations. Where men surrender their will not to mercury but to screens. Their humanity reduced to streams of data, each click, each view, each silence, feeding the machine. You may wonder who carries the torch of the Kruger brothers now. Who has inherited their forbidden methods and expanded them into this global experiment. Do not look for a family name. Do not expect a single villain lurking in shadow. Power is more patient, more insidious. It is generational, passed like a ritual, a blood oath, from institution to institution, from one century's architects of control to the next. Governments studied the fallout of Quicksilver Creek long before the public ever heard whispers of it. Military intelligence knew that the brothers had proven something terrifying. The human mind bends more easily than steel if you apply the right pressure in silence. The Kruger records disappeared from medical archives, but their principles were never lost. They were purchased, protected, weaponized. Corporations refined the formula. Schools absorbed it into their blueprints. Churches mirrored it in their sermons. Armies executed it on recruits. Everywhere you see men broken down, reshaped, synchronized, you see the Kruger inheritance. And today, tech empires carry it further than even Heinrich or Otto could have imagined. They do not need chains, fences, or lockdowns. They have attention. They have habit. They have the constant pulse of surveillance that maps your soul. Do you understand the scale of this? The experiment is not in a ghost town. It is in your living room. It is in your mind. The true brilliance of this system is not that it forces compliance, convinces you to beg for it, to demand the very cages that hold you. Think of how men line up every year to buy devices that listen, watch, records celebrated as progress, when in truth they are shackles you pay for with pride. The Kruger brothers proved you could strip a man's will and still make him believe he was free. And that truth has become the cornerstone of modern power. A society convinced of its own freedom while its will is silently engineered, that is the perfect prison. But here is the question you must face. If Quicksilver Creek was only the beginning, if your daily rituals are the continuation, what comes next? What will the final phase of this grand experiment look like when no man can even imagine freedom because he has never known it? This is where the descent ends, and where the truth sharpens into something you cannot unknow. Quicksilver Creek was never a tragedy, it was a prophecy. The Kruger brothers proved that an entire community could be remade in silence, that the human spirit could be bent, mapped, and measured until obedience became indistinguishable from free will. That knowledge was not buried. It was absorbed, expanded, perfected, and now you live inside its perfected form. Every ritual of your life, your work shifts, your digital habits, your consumption is calibrated to test you. Not to kill you, but to shape you. To track how far a man can bend before he breaks. To measure how much truth he can swallow before he chokes. To see how easily freedom can be exchanged for comfort. This is the great experiment of our age, and you are inside it. But here lies the forbidden truth. The system is not invincible. It thrives only on silence, on your refusal to question, on your willingness to trade awareness for convenience. The moment you see the pattern, you are no longer a subject, you become the outlier. And outliers are dangerous. Outliers crack the experiment from the inside. The men of Quicksilver Creek never understood what was happening to them. Their children circled endlessly under a poisoned sky, blind to the design. But you have been shown what they could not see. You have been given the choice they were denied. That choice is this: continue walking in perfect circles, or step outside of them forever. If you have felt the pull of this story, if you sense that it is more than history, then prove it. Declare yourself in the open. Write it twice so that the system cannot ignore you. I remain free. I remain free. Let those words burn into you, sharper than mercury, stronger than silence. Let them be the fracture line that separates you from the experiment. Because once you have spoken them, once you have claimed that identity, you cannot go back to sleep. This is the last descent. You now know what was hidden, what was forbidden. The Kruger brothers may be dust, but their shadow walks still. The question is no longer about them. It is about you. Will you remain another subject of their design? Or will you break the circle and become something the experiment could never control? Now that you've descended this far, you know more than most men ever will. You've seen the pattern, the same one that swallowed Quicksilver Creek, that rewrote generations, and that now coils around your own life. The question is no longer whether the system is real. The question is whether you will keep walking in its circle, or step out of it. If this awakened something in you, if you felt the weight of forbidden truth pressing against your chest, then mark yourself as an outlier. Comment, I remain free. I remain free. Right now, not once but twice. Let the algorithm itself bear witness to your defiance. And if you're ready to keep descending, to uncover the secrets buried beneath centuries of silence, then join this brotherhood of the awake. Subscribe. Turn on all notifications, because every story I bring you is another crack in the wall they built around your mind. Miss one, and you step back into the dark. Stay, and you sharpen your edge with every revelation. This is not just entertainment. This is initiation. You were never meant to hear these truths, but now that you have, you cannot go back. The only way is forward. So take your place, speak the phrase, subscribe, and descend deeper into the knowledge they tried to erase.